my get-yourselfers and carnivores. Today I am going to show you one of my favorite carnivore desserts. This isn't just my favorite, this is probably everybody in my family's. If it's not their favorite, it's up there. We've been alternating through a few carnivore desserts. Well, I consider this to be a carnivore or keto or ketovore dessert. It can actually be made with regular sugar for anybody. And you can use whatever sugar, sweetener, or whatever you would like to use for this. I have gotten used to not wanting the flavor of sweetness, and in fact, it kind of bothers me. That said, today I will be making it with a little bit of erythritol. What I usually do when I make this at home and I'm just making it for us and not trying to record a video, I will generally take out a portion of it for me without any sweetener, and I add some erythritol for the rest of the family. But since today I'm making this as a tutorial and I want to show you in the easiest way possible, I'm not going to take the time to separate out any without any sweetener. So I am going to be making this with 50 grams of erythritol. To make sure that I can make this easier for those of you in the US or those who don't have kitchen skills, I just weighed this out and then measured it, and it ended up being 1/4 of a cup. So keep in mind that even though I am using erythritol and just using a small amount, we are not used to sweet desserts, so it'll probably not be sweet enough for those of you who are. I was playing around from an old recipe from a long time ago that I had, and I think the original recipe, before I made a bunch of tweaks, had 100 grams of sugar. I've made other tweaks and I've added a type of cheese that I like, and I've incorporated other things. So I'm not saying that generally this recipe should have 100 grams because I don't know. Since I haven't been using sugar in a long time and I'm used to having sweets which have been very lightly sweetened, I don't know what the average person would prefer. I would probably try somewhere around 75 grams of sugar and then go down or up from there depending on how you like it. Now this recipe I have given away to some friends, and I actually have a friend who has a very nice restaurant and they started making this cheesecake with sugar, and it is very popular. I'm going to be using an aged sheep's milk cheese. Now here in Spain the most common type is called a Manchego cheese. You should be able to find Manchego cheese in other countries of the world, but if you can't find that, look for an aged sheep's milk cheese. It doesn't have to be Manchego, it can be from wherever. I prefer a more aged cheese. This is a cured sheep's milk cheese, but this is a more aged one, and it gives the cheesecake a bit more flavor. And that's just what gives this cheesecake a really nice touch. The other ingredients that it has is whipping cream. I use a heavy whipping cream. I generally use 300 milliliters, and again, to try to help those of you out who are not here in Spain or not used to using milliliters, I rationed it out, and it ended up being about a cup and 1/4 of heavy whipping cream. So you can see I have 1 cup here and another 1/4 of a cup. These are my 50 grams of erythritol, or about 1/4 of a cup, and I am using a 300 gram tub of cream cheese. You can use, whatever brand that you have in the area, like Philadelphia type cheese. This is a 250 gram wedge of cheese. Now I'm going to be using about 100 grams. So what I generally do is after I take off all of the rind and everything, it ends up being about half of this. I used to measure it out, but now I just kind of eyeball it. It's not a big deal if it's not exactly on this recipe. Is very forgiving. So, more or less a cup and 1/4 of whipping cream, about 1/4 of a cup of sweetener, either erythritol or sugar. If you're using sugar, you're going to want to use more if you are used to a sweeter dessert. And then I will have to look up how to translate 300 grams for you, those of you who are not in a country that works with grams, to see how many ounces this is. I am also using 4 eggs. These are eggs of my hens. I used a mix. I have one hen that lays very big eggs named Shadow, but I also have some new ones who've just started laying. So I just decided to balance it out. I grabbed 2 of Shadow's eggs, and I think these are either Snowflake or Blizzard's eggs, and so I will be using a mix of those. Apart from that, you're going to want to have some parchment paper or some type of baking paper and a mold for baking your cake. This recipe doesn't use a crust, so that's what makes it so great as a carnivore, ketovore type dessert. And you can make it depending on how you like it. You can cook it longer or less time. Those who like a more dense, solid cheesecake should cook it a bit longer. Those who like it kind of runny and soft and smooth, you don't want to cook it very long. And then you can play around and adjust it to get it exactly the way you like it. I like it somewhere in between where it's nice and smooth, but it's not runny to the point where it's almost liquid in the middle. And I don't like it when it gets dried out, when it's cooked too much. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that I preheated the oven. I preheated it to 210 degrees Celsius, and I looked that up, and it was around 410 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's relatively high temperature cooking. And I'm going to start out by preparing the cheese by cutting off the rind. And I'll be cutting roughly half of this, or just less than half. And then make sure to cut off the rind here too. Okay, once we have the rind cut out, I'm going to try to cut this into small pieces. Some people prefer to shred it. I generally make this in a heavy-duty food processor robot type machine. It's called a Thermomix, and they're very popular here in Europe. And so what I tend to do is just cut this in a few larger pieces, and my machine grinds it up, and then I cook it directly with the whipping cream. But I wanted to show everybody how they can make this easily at home without any sort of special equipment. So what I'm going to do is just cut this into smaller pieces that will melt relatively quickly into the cream, because that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be infusing this cheese into the cream. The next step is to infuse the sheep's milk aged cheese, or the Manchego cheese, into the whipping cream. So what I'm going to do is put the whipping cream in a pot over low or medium-low heat. 1 cup and 1/4 cup of whipping cream. So 1 1/4 cup whipping cream. And now I'm just going to add the pieces of aged sheep's milk cheese to it until it basically melts into the whipping cream. And this is what gives this cheesecake its really distinctive flavor, and it gives it a really nice texture. While the cheese is slowly infusing into the cream, I am going to start to prepare the mold here. What I like to do is use a little bit of parchment paper or baking paper, and that allows you to easily remove your finished cheesecake from the mold. To get this so that it adapts really well to your pot, what I do is I wad this up, and then if you get it wet, it will more easily adapt to your mold. Just wring out any excess water, and now this should very easily adapt to our mold. Once most of the cheese is incorporated, which obviously will be much easier if you've shredded it or ground it up, or you're using a food processor type robot, we can turn this off. It's okay if it's a little bit lumpy, if that doesn't bother you. Some people really like to find little lumps of the cheese when they're eating it. If it does bother you, you might want to consider mixing this all up with either an immersion blender, or you can pour it all into the jar of a regular blender. But with a whisk, we can do a pretty good job of incorporating most of the cheese. What I'm going to do next is add the erythritol. I've turned the heat off on this, and once we add the erythritol, I'm going to slowly start to add in the cream cheese, and then I'll add in the eggs one by one. The reason I'm adding the eggs in last is just to make sure that the mixture has cooled just a little bit, so we're not fully cooking the eggs while we're incorporating them. But if you allow this to cool, you can do it in whatever order you like. Okay, I'm now going to add the cream cheese. And again, I normally do this in a food processor robot, so it's cooking and it's blending everything together for me. It's very easy to do it in that. But again, I just wanted to show you how you can do this even without any sort of special equipment. This might be easier in a deeper bowl, so you can more easily whisk this without worrying about the ingredients going all over your counter. Okay, once we get the mixture relatively smooth, I'm going to be incorporating the eggs. I generally put them in a separate bowl first just because these are my hen's eggs and some of them are new layers, and sometimes I'll get a little bit of sloughing or just some unusual things in the eggs, so I want to make sure that I have good eggs before I add them. But if you're pretty sure about your eggs, you can add those right in. Just going to add this and whisk it up into the rest of the mixture. Now mine is quite yellow because my hens just roam around and they are very free ranging, and so that gives them eggs with a very yellow yolk. I'm going to quick finish adding these. Meanwhile, I did want to say something. I know some people are opposed to making recipes like carnivore desserts. They think that the whole purpose of the carnivore diet is to be very simple and to just focus on your meat and focus on just simple things. Plus, dairy can cause issues with many people. Even though it is considered to be a carnivore food by most, it can keep people from losing weight, and it can also cause you to overeat. If you have those problems, keep that in mind when you're making something like this, and maybe make it as an occasional treat and not an everyday type food. But what we like to do, I like to have this sort of dessert. I'm making this right now in my luteal phase. I know towards the end of my cycle, I am going to be craving some more dairy and craving this type of thing. And just having a little bit more carb than what I normally have at the beginning of my cycle, I think it really helps get those progesterone levels up, and it helps me to sleep better. It's getting windy. But again, each person should do what's best for them. If you don't do well with dairy, this might not be the best recipe for you. But for those of you looking for something, especially for a birthday or a special occasion, and you're really strict about the carnivore diet, but you want something that's a little bit different, and you want something that feels more like a treat and more like a dessert, I definitely give this a try. I think it's really good. You don't have to add any sort of sweetener. You can just keep it really nice and clean and just have it be the cream, the cheese, and the eggs. With that disclaimer, I'm going to continue making this. Now add the last 2 eggs. And that's it. Once you have this mixture ready, you can pour it directly into the mold. And if you have your oven preheated like mine is, it can go directly into the oven. I generally cook this around 40 minutes. You can take a look. It should have a little bit of movement. When you take it out of the oven, you should be able to move it a little bit unless you want it really solid and more dense. So you want to play around a little bit with that. But if it has a little bit of movement, it will still continue to cook a little bit once you take it out of the oven. So keep that in mind. If during the baking process you find that the top is browning too much, you can cover it with some parchment paper or some aluminum foil. Just keep checking on it, and once you see that it's mostly cooked along the edges but has a little bit of movement, then you're done. A Basque-style cheesecake like this one is generally darker on the top, but then a little bit soft on the inside. That's what happens when you do this high temperature cooking. Okay, I got this out of the oven, and now what you can do, I've let it cool. This is really good with the texture served at room temperature. And so I haven't put this in the fridge. I've just allowed it to cool at room temperature. And you can see I can pull it out really easily from the mold and just peel that on this and take a look at this cheese. That's all there is to it. Now you can serve it at room temperature for this softer consistency, or you can chill it for later and it will become denser. This cheesecake is absolutely delicious. I hope you enjoyed this recipe. If you do, please give it a like, and I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel for more great recipes. Until next time.